I will take you with me. You might learn something.
About soccer?
Nah, mate. Not about soccer. And for fuck's sake, stop saying soccer.
Well, for a change, we're starting with a direct quote about soccer and anarchism today. Ready? It seems to be about simplicity. Football at its heart is a simple game, and anarchism from the heart is a simple wish. The sport's fundamental ease has taken it around the world and dragged us with it. It's one of the most wonderful things when we meet someone new at a game, or a bond strengthened at dinner, or a bar after we play. If the football field is essentially a meeting place for play, it must then extend to wherever people enjoy being with each other. That's where anarchy might start, or at least where it can blossom. Bringing football and anarchism together is a natural, a symbiotic thing. That was from Carlos Fernandez, a Chicago-based radical activist, from a book by Gabriel Kuhn called Soccer versus the State, subtitled Tackling Football and Radical Politics. And with that, welcome to the Assistant Professor of Football, where I am talking today to Gabriel, the author of that book. And the quote already tells you that this is not only the second, more political episode of this podcast, but it also has a bit more of a US connection than my usual ones. Gabriel Kuhn began his work on this book when he moved from Austria to the US, yes, just like me, to study here. He has a PhD in philosophy, and he discovered the appeal of soccer he knew from playing semi-professionally in Austria's second league, not like me at all. The appeal of that game to left, liberal, progressive, radical, anarchist circles in the US. His biography is fascinating, and his book, which turned out to be part travel memoir, part handbook, part a collection of vignettes of an alternative kind of soccer, is as well. It came out in its second edition now in 2019, and we'll talk about how it came about, what it wants, and Gabriel's own journey, which led him to Sweden, where he lives today. I also asked him about gender in football, about religion, and about whether football isn't just a distraction from the really, really important works of justice around the world by and for common people. And you can guess that both of our answer to that is no, but more on that later. And yes, I know I teased an episode on Stockholm's soccer rivalries and derbies during the Fun Last Song in the second German Bundesliga episode, the last one just before Christmas. And yes, that episode really is coming. It's just not this one. It will be the next one. Very quickly, the usual word of housekeeping here. I am really grateful you are listening. I see dots on the map all over America and Europe as well. Please spread the word of mouth, or social media if you know somebody who might enjoy this different kind of soccer coverage. And thank you so much for that. You also know that ratings and subscriptions are kind of a currency that an independent podcast like this one has to travel in, and are pretty much the only thing that helps it become discoverable on the web. Thank you so much for that help. And now, Gabriel Kuhn, author, philosopher, world traveler, and former goalkeeper in the second Austrian league. Welcome, Gabriel. You are not just a visiting professor today, you are also the only person I've talked to on this podcast who has actually played soccer semi-professionally, in your case in Austria's second league. And then you stopped rather abruptly and went to university and started writing about politics and philosophy in sports. Could you tell me a little bit about how growing up with soccer and your playing career looked like, and how the break and the shift into writing about sports and politics came about for you?
Where shall I start? When I was a child, I was only interested in sports. Really, that was my only interest until I was about 15 or 16, and I competed in different sports. Soccer was one of them. And at the age of 12 or 13, I kind of had to make a choice with regard to which sport to focus on to perhaps then be able to compete on a higher level later. And for different reasons, I chose soccer. One of them was that the other sports that I competed in were individual sports, mainly alpine skiing. and tennis, and it was much harder to get anywhere because where I grew up in the Austrian province of the Tyrol, especially in skiing, you pretty much had to be amongst the top 2, maybe 3 racers in your year to have a chance of getting sponsored and getting extra training. In soccer, it was enough to be among the top 16 or 18 to make the provincial squad. So it was just easier that way. And then at the time we had something in Austria which was called, there were places that were called Bundesjugendleistungszentren. So for all of our listeners who like long German words, that's a great example. Basically, those were places where talented players were gathered to receive special training and get prepared for a possible professional career. I played at that youth talent scouting center, or whatever you want to call it, for a couple of years, but it was in the provincial capital in Innsbruck, which was quite far from the town I grew up in. While we had a second league, so that at that time in Austria, there was a semi-professional team, a second league team in the town I went to high school to, which was very close. And they offered me to play for them at the age of 15, which, at the time that was very young.
What is that town and club?
Oh, that was the town is called Kufstein, and the team is FC Kufstein. And I think today, now for a long time, they've been playing in the third league. When I played for them in the late 1980s, that was actually the best time, I think, in the history of the club. So they were well established in the second league at the time. I was with them for one season where we had a shot of being of making it to the first league. We failed, but we were fairly close. So it was an interesting time. I got to travel around Austria, and I got to play both with players who had played professional football and on the national team before, and were taking it fairly easy during their final years in the second league, but also with young players my age who then went on to make to a proper professional career and also played in the national team. I was not one of them for different reasons, but it's nice memories to have played with these people.
And then your playing career ended after that year. Is that right?
Yeah. So what happened was that, as I said earlier, until I was 15, 16, sports was really my only interest. And then that changed because I started to get interested in mainly politics. And then also as I got older, I wanted to go traveling, and I was looking forward to doing some studies. And so sports wasn't all that important anymore. Plus, I also, with the interest in politics, which already at the time was a strong interest in progressive left-wing politics, there were some contradictions to the environment I encountered, or I moved in the sports world, which was pretty hierarchical, and you had sponsors and club owners who had a lot of influence over the game without really having much interest or knowledge about it. The soccer culture itself also was quite sexist and homophobic. A lot of everyday racism involved as well in the locker room. Playing whether it was second or third league, it wasn't that attractive, to be honest. It was interesting and exciting in the beginning, but then the pay at the time wasn't very good. As I said, very time consuming, a lot of traveling throughout the country on the weekends, very often. I mean, sometimes there were exciting games with a few thousand spectators. Sometimes you'd play in front of 400 or 500 after, a bus journey of 10 hours, and then the bus journey back at 10 hours. So all of that started to make the soccer career less attractive. However, since I grew up with that dream of becoming a professional soccer player, I kind of, at the age of 18, then I made a decision, which was that I'd play another season with this second league team. And then at the end of the season, I would either get an offer to join a first league club and have an actual shot at a professional career, or I would just quit. And I never got that offer. So since then, which now is like 30 years ago, I mean, I've been playing soccer, but only in, on this sort of pickup game level.
Your biography isn't that of a typical footballer already. Up until then, I read that you lived in multiple different countries, including the Middle East and Pacific Islands. And then you studied philosophy in Austria and America as well. You traveled a lot from an early age. Is that right?
So with the different countries, a lot of that was when I was very young. So before I went to school. So the first 6 years of my life, I didn't live in Austria. I lived in various places. And then, so my dad's a musician. So that's why my parents traveled a lot. And then essentially, I grew up in this small town in the Tyrol because it was time to go to school, and my parents figured that, I shouldn't have to change school every year. I guess since that always had been a part of my life, I kind of wanted to go back to that. So even with my studies, the philosophy studies, they were divided between Austria and the States. I had been to the US quite a lot as a teenager because of my dad's work. And so it's kind of a natural thing. I always liked going there. So it was sort of a natural thing to do part of my studies there. And then when I finished my studies when I was 24, since then, so this is the mid-1990s, since then I haven't lived in Austria at all. I just go there and visit. I traveled a lot, lived in different places, and came to Sweden 15 years ago.
Where did you study in the US?
Arizona State, Tempe. No soccer, but lots of. I went to see the football games.
While we're in the US, what most of the American listeners of this podcast probably don't know, I don't know, I don't want to assume too much, but there was, and in some cases still is, a fairly close connection between soccer, the rise of soccer as a game, and kind of an anarchist radical subculture in the United States. And the roots of your book are there in some way and are quite American in that way as well. I may not have phrased this really well now. Could you explain that connection to us a little bit?
What happened there was that, as I said, so I finished my semi-professional soccer career. I left Austria. I started traveling. And it was in the early 2000s when I spent a lot of time in the States. I no longer went to school there, but I went there every year and stayed for a few months or up to half a year. And I noticed that when I went to progressive, radical meetings or gatherings, there was a lot of soccer. I remember very clearly I went to the anarchist book fair in San Francisco, and there was a soccer tournament outside, which was, organized alongside the book fair. That to me seemed very strange. I grew up in an environment in Europe where football or sports in general weren't very highly regarded in the left or radical left. There was a lot of opiate of the masses, and then the whole nationalist aspects of the competitiveness. So I was very curious, and of course, I mean, I also enjoyed it. I remember, I was very excited, and I found a team and played in that tournament. But the more I looked into it, and the more I talked to people who played soccer at these events, I found that, and that's maybe where some European snobbery comes through. I mean, I was very excited that they liked the game, but when I talked to them, it seemed that they knew very little about it. So about the history, about clubs, so they enjoyed playing it, but there was not the historical, cultural, political knowledge. And at that time, so again, it's the early 2000s, I was doing a lot of zines, just writing. I was traveling a lot, and that was something I could do. I always enjoyed writing. And so I did these little zines that I then distributed, and some bigger distributors helped distribute. And I felt that I wanted to write something about soccer which was called then an anarchist soccer manual. So essentially just what I said. I felt like, okay, here are people who like the game. They know very little about it. I write something that if they're interested, they can read to learn more about the history and the politics of the game. And that zine that came out at the time became for a zine fairly popular. And to make a long story short, the publisher that then later brought out Soccer versus the State, they knew about the zine and they asked me if I wanted to turn it into a book that they would bring out. And so that's how the first edition, which I think came out in 2010, came about. And the one that you refer to, that is a 2019 edition, which I think there's an appendix of maybe 50 pages with additional texts and interviews and stuff that sort of covers the 2000 teens.
You dropped a few terms now. Can we clarify the landscape a little bit here? There is, on the one hand, the famous opiate of the masses code, right? So the idea that common folks get duped in a way by playing sports or by following sports and distracted from the revolutionary causes in their own lives and their communities' lives that really matter. I'd be curious about your response to that approach to sports and radical politics. And the other thing you mentioned, the anarchist book fair and anarchist subculture in general. How does that square with what listeners may understand as the progressive world in the US today? So can we map the left here a little bit as well, maybe?
Okay, so the first part for me is easier than the second because I haven't been to the States in a long time, but we'll get there. Quickly about the opiate of the masses argument. As a side note, someone like Noam Chomsky, for example, is a well-known theorist on the left who, whenever he mentions or says anything about sports, he pretty much refers to that argument. So I think what it means is, yeah, as you said, so it's a distraction. It's of no relevance really. And I mean, that's true intellectually. Who cares who wins a ball game? It doesn't matter. But it draws the attention away from important political issues, actual problems that people have in their lives, and becomes this distraction. Kind of like the reference to what Marx and Engels said about the role that religion plays in a lot of people's lives. It's a sort of escapism.
Right.
Now, I think quite obviously there is a lot of truth to that. That's how people who follow sports. That's the role that sports plays for a lot of people, that it plays in society. But that's only one side to it. Sport is a very complex phenomenon, and especially a sport like soccer, which involves millions of people worldwide, both as players and spectators, has all sorts of different dimensions and potentials. And if you go back, for example, to the World Cup, the Men's World Cup that's been played at Qatar, so that's the top end of the worst of football. Commercialization's terrible. We've seen that now with the final as well, how politicians try to capitalize on their national team's successes. There's a lot of corruption involved, et cetera, et cetera. But you have still what's often referred to as the people's game, or the grassroots game of football, with, again, millions of people worldwide being involved in it. And I think that there is a lot to, and we can maybe get to that later, but there is a lot to learn from sports in general, and perhaps especially from soccer, just because it's an easy sport to play and it's very popular the world over. And so while there is a lot of truth to the opiate of the masses argument, I don't think that it's the whole truth. There is much more to it. So it's not a wrong argument, but it's not a sufficient argument to talk about sports. The second question, the progressive movement, anarchist movements, I don't know. The political landscape, I don't feel comfortable talking about the political landscape in the US today because I haven't been there in 15 years. a lot has changed, not just in the US, but the world over, not least with the corona crisis and presidencies like the one of Donald Trump in the US. I feel like the whole left-right spectrum has changed in many ways. But if you go back to the book that I wrote and what I said about me witnessing soccer being popular in, I would say, both progressive and radical circles, it's often the same values that progressives would that make progressives embrace football and radicals. So, for example, in my personal analysis of why soccer appeared in those contexts that I found it in the States in the early 2000s, was often that soccer was seen as a less commercial game than the big professional games, as American football, baseball, or basketball, which are that's where the big money was. And the early 2000s, there have been different experiments throughout history with professional soccer leagues in the US, and now the major soccer league is fairly well established. But that, I think, I'm not exactly sure about the years, but I think it was the early 2000s that it was introduced. So at the time I was there, soccer clearly wasn't part, and I think it still is not part of the big professional team sports in the US. So that was one aspect. Another one is that it was seen as an immigrant sport. So that, I think, was attractive to a lot of people, especially Latino communities were very much into soccer, but also different immigrant communities from Austria, from Europe or Africa. Plus, that in the US, the status of women's soccer is, for different reasons, historically higher than in a lot of other countries. Right. I think all of those aspects made soccer, appear to be an attractive sport for people along the whole range of liberal leftist politics, from progressive to radical.
What I see today, and what is part of, I guess, the drive behind some of what I'm trying to do here, is I see a lot of interest in soccer among college-educated, more middle-class, progressive-leaning folks. And to tie that interest into what is often European soccer back to the radical roots of the game, both in the US and as a working-class sport in Europe, is getting increasingly difficult. And you mentioned some of the reasons why, right? Commercialization, part of this is simply the growth of the game in the US as well, and perhaps away from an immigrant or a kind of an edgy niche sport and into the mainstream. And to keep those connections in mind and to continue to develop them is, I think, part of what my interest here is. And what I think the book can serve to do as well. Should we talk about the book a little bit? I'm noticing that on the one hand, it reads very hands-on, at times almost like a manual on how to create a different kind of soccer. And on the other hand, it's extremely global. We travel, I think, on pretty much all the continents here. You have interviews in there with actors, coaches, players, organizers from various ends of the globe. What ties it together? More the handbook approach or the world journey travel book approach? How did you design the book?
My hope would be that those two things go together and build a whole. Like, I think if someone asked me, what do you think is the best thing about Soccer versus the State? Like, why should I read this book rather than other books about soccer that also look at the sport from a progressive angle? But my answer would be that it contains both sides. So I feel you learn something about the game, about its history, on a global scale. By learning something about that history, hopefully you would also see the traces of what has gone wrong or what the problems with the game are, and what has led to what we call the modern football industry today, with all the commercialism and the corruption and everything. And yet, on the other hand, you also learn something about possible alternatives, both historically and what people are doing today. So the kind of grassroots football that I was mentioning before, fan-run clubs, progressive supporter culture, like that's also in there. I think a lot of other books focus on one or the other. So either you have a critical history of the game, or you have a presentation of alternatives in soccer, a book about fan-owned clubs in the UK, or about anti-fascist supporter culture. What I've been trying to do with Soccer versus the State is bring those two things together, which arguably corresponds to my political approach, because you have to, if you want to change things, you have to look at what's there, criticize what's there, find ways to weaken the parts that you don't like, but you can't do that without pointing to concrete alternatives. So I've been trying to do those things together in one book.
There are a lot of little interviews in here with organizers from anti-fascist fan clubs and organizations, with former players, former coaches, with editors of fan magazines, all kinds of people that take us into that world. It's a very simple question. How did you find all these people? Is this just a result of your own travel, or is there a whole world out there that normal soccer coverage just doesn't get, but where all these people live? How might listeners connect to that world, other than reading your book, of course?
You're hinting at the answer there, because there is an alternative football network out there, which, especially in this day and age with the internet and everything, is fairly well connected. To give you a concrete example, a month ago, I think I was at the anarchist book fair in Amsterdam, tabling for PM Press, and a guy comes up and looks at Soccer versus the State, which is on the table, and we start talking about it, and it turns out this is a person from Greece who's written a master's thesis, I think, about autonomous sports clubs in Greece, which I knew some about. There's some in the book as well, but he told me stuff that I did not know about. But now that's a new contact. He sent me some stuff that is written in English. So this is how that happens. You build a network of people who help. And in that sense, I should also say Soccer versus the State really is, it's a collective effort at the end of the day. I mean, I've been pulling the information together and turned it into a book, but there's a lot of people who have contributed with information and interviews and their own texts, which are included, and photos and illustrations. So yeah, it's really an expression of a worldwide collective of radical football players and supporters. And yeah.
And is there something that connects that world that you just described to, let's say, your chapter 1, right? You begin the book by outlining a history, truth, and myths about football as a working class sport. We start in England, late 19th century kind of classic narrative. Without trying to flatten history here, is there an arch from back then to the world of the radical edge of football that you've explored?
Yeah, I think it does. Maybe the key term here would be common people, or whatever term it is that we like to use to describe.
Jarvis Cocker's term.
Sorry, what's that?
That's Jarvis Cocker's term.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, I think it's a term that can certainly be used. Others could be used as well to describe people who don't have a lot of economic, social, or cultural capital, who don't have a lot of power. And historically, so when football emerges in England in the late 19th century, you have class society is very clearly defined. And parts of the myths about soccer as a working class sport is that the upper classes were involved in soccer from the very beginning as organizers of the game, as owners of the teams, the refectory owners, churches, that they were involved very early on. The working class aspect is that a lot of the players, or the majority of the players, were working class people. And then when it became really popular as a spectator sport, the vast majority of the spectators also were working class people. Now, even if today class societies, not only in England, but I guess across the world, have become more complex and more complicated, and there are different levels of self-identification as working class or not, regardless of the particular working class aspect, evidently, if we go back to the term, common people around the world are still the backbone to soccer culture and the popularity of soccer. So you can travel to any country in Africa and go to the poorest villages, and people will play soccer. It's a popular game across different class levels in Europe, Latin America, even in the US still. I think in the US it actually becomes a little more complicated because it's also seen as kind of a college sport. So I think the class aspects in the US are particularly complicated. But worldwide, I would say that especially if you look at Latin America, I mean, it's still part of the myth of someone, especially, like Diego Maradona still is, that he's someone who came from the poorest sections of Argentine society and then became this famous, for some people, almost godlike football player. So no, I think there is this is something that hasn't disappeared, those working class roots of the game of soccer. It's just been transformed because society in general has been transformed dramatically in the past 150 years. But there is this grassroots element to the game left.
I hope so. That could be, add an example perhaps. I mean, you move from working class roots to basically radical interventions in the professional game today. What is an example of a successful, you would say, radical intervention in professional commercialized football as it exists today?
I think this is fairly close to home, but I would say that even objectively, it's true that if you look at successful examples, you have to look at the organization of football supporters in Germany, especially in a network founded in, I believe, 1994, called BAF. That's the acronym. Originally it was called Bündnis Antifaschistischer Fußballfans, so Alliance of Anti-Fascist Football Supporters. Then they changed the A from anti-fascist to active, which I guess appealed to a broader clientele, perhaps. But there people have been. So this is supporters who are active / anti-fascist on the left, again, from progressive to radical, organized in most professional clubs in Germany, and who have, for example, kept German football stadiums from becoming all-seater stadiums. So there have always been terraces where you're allowed to stand, which is a big part historically of working class football culture. Also, prices in German football stadiums are still fairly okay. It's not the Premier League where you have to fork out, I don't know, half of a working class person's monthly salary to go to one game, and now the majority of people who go to the big games in London are football tourists who fly in and watch those games. So you don't have those elements in Germany. There's also more democratic influence that fans have on the clubs, because there's something called the 50+1 rule in Germany, which means that members of the club have to have a majority influence on the club's decision. So for example, what happens also in American professional sports, or what happens in the Premier League in soccer in England, that essentially rich people can come in and buy soccer clubs and then treat them as their corporate toys. Like, that can't happen in Germany, and a lot of that is because of the organization of those fans. Ironically, and I very rarely see that connected, even among liberal progressive writers, that the German Bundesliga is also, in terms of its the numbers of spectators, the most popular football league in Europe, and to me that is clearly connected to the grassroots, the supporters being more involved in the organization of the game than in other countries.
That's probably one of the most accessible ones too. If you just look at ticket prices and compare between England and Germany, there's a significant difference there. Yeah.
Even in these big leagues, are there examples from recent history or from today that you would name of clubs, players maybe?
For example, in Brazil, around the club Corinthians, with a player like Socrates in the early 80s who was playing there. So this was during the military dictatorship in Brazil, where under the influence of players like Socrates, the whole club did two things at the same time, which was very interesting under the name of Democratic Corinthians. So they changed the culture of the club with the players having more influence, but used that also as an example of how society in general should be organized. So there was a clear political anti-dictatorship message. Obviously, the one club example that always comes up today is that of FC St. Pauli in Hamburg, which is very often referred to as an anti-fascist club, which is something that for some reason annoys me. I think it's because the club itself is just a club. I mean, there are more progressively minded people involved, even on the top level, if you look at the president and everything. But the club itself is just a club that has to function in professional football like all other clubs have to function. So they have to sell their trademark, and they trade players. And if someone doesn't play well enough, it's not that they still keep them on the payroll just because of their political convictions or whatever. So the club itself is just a club. I don't think it's an anti-fascist club as such. But the influence, there's a strong influence. As I said before, in Germany, fans have a relatively strong influence on the club compared to other countries. And since the fan culture around St. Pauli is, again, on this progressive to radical spectrum, there is more of that culture around the club. So that's certainly true. Then I think just in recent years, there was a book that came out specifically about St. Pauli in English, I think written by people from Spain or the Basque Country. I don't remember. So there's a lot, St. Pauli, there's a lot of focus on that. So there are some examples, but to me personally, the grassroots stuff is much more interesting because I think make it very simple. I mean, the professional game is so rotten that it's hard to reform it. The examples I use there with the BAF, the organized supporters in Germany, were because it's a very concrete example that even on that level, that sort of activism can have an influence. It has very little to do with revolutionary politics or anything like that, but it's an example of being able to make a difference as an activist, even within the professional game, which is important if you want to take that a few steps further and think about the future of the game and how you could possibly make more radical changes so that, for example, we won't see another World Cup like that in Qatar. Although, I mean, Qatar is just the peak of the iceberg. It's not that, the other World Cups we've had in the past 20, 30, 40 years were wonderful. I mean, all of the problems we've seen in Qatar now, we're already there. It's just that for different reasons with this World Cup, they just became particularly obvious.
Yeah. I think the St. Pauli book you're referring to is Karl's vignettes, Another Football is Possible.
Great.
St. Pauli, something like that. Yeah.
The professor comes in. Great.
He would probably be a good guest here at some point too. Well, judging from what you tell me now and the impossibility of radical politics in a way in professional football, and what you said about the opiate of the masses argument, what can progressive politics and radical politics actually learn from soccer? So why should people who maybe aren't necessarily interested in soccer consider the possibilities that you're outlining here?
Right. Because there is a lot of social learning in sports in general, and then that's even more pronounced in a team sport, and then that's even more pronounced in a team sport that is the most popular team sport in the world. So that is one reason. I think that this is another sort of discussion, but I personally I'm a firm believer in fair play, sportsmanship, team spirit, that kind of stuff. Which, if you do it the right way, and I think again on the grassroots level, you encounter a lot of that. The higher you go up in the hierarchy, the less you'll find of it. But if you learn those values in general, I think that's very good for your political organizing and the way you think about society and the way you interact with other people. And I think sports, and again, especially team sports, soccer as maybe the just most popular example in the world, are very good places to learn that. So that's one reason. Sports, and then perhaps especially at least in a collective level, team sports and soccer, they're empowering. A lot of people who don't have much power in society otherwise can, at least in the world. There are different possibilities, different experiences you can make in the world of sports that lead to that. That was the big argument, for example, in the worker sports movement, or one of the big arguments at the beginning of the 20th century, that collectively the working class is empowered through the experience of sports and through sport competition, because class always plays into it. And especially today, again, if you look at professional sports, class plays into it in many ways. Who has the resources to even become a professional athlete and all of that? But on the playing field itself, there are other factors that play a role. And I could say that also from the football clubs I played in, for example. If you came from a middle class family, in terms of your status, that wasn't necessarily an advantage. Might have even been a disadvantage depending on the particular club you were in. But different sort of hierarchies and social relationships emerge on the playing field. That's different from what happens in society. So that's another aspect where you can take experiences from sport that can help also with political organizing. And there's other aspects for communication. I also a strong believer in cultural aspects having to be included in political organizing, and I would see sports as part of people's everyday culture. And especially internationally, I feel that my travels have confirmed that in many ways. Also, if you work, for example, with immigrant communities where there are language barriers, sport are a great means to bring people together who otherwise find it maybe hard to share much and come together. And people coming together is always a basis for political organizing. And so there are a lot of those aspects. Another thing, though, just in answer to your question, why should people or political activists who are not interested in sports, why should they still care about sports? And then maybe particularly soccer, because it's so popular as a political terrain. It's because that's what it is. So what shall I say to someone who has no interest in sports? I can't, force them to watch soccer games or play soccer. And it'd be ridiculous to claim that that's what they have to do to become great organizers or revolutionaries. Yet, if you go back to this opiate of the masses argument, if you discredit all that and say that's of no interest to anybody, you're missing out on one of the most political terrains we have. To use one example that I and some other people often use, but I just think it's a very good example. If you look at if you stay in Europe, but that's true in many other continents, although in some countries it will be other sports, there are no places where as many people gather as regularly as in sports stadiums. So that in itself gives those sports events a huge political significance. I mean, whatever you want to say about the World Cup in Qatar and what happened, there's been so much political discussion around the event on all sorts of levels, whether it's migrant workers' rights or the corruption of FIFA or sports organizing, or LGBTQ plus people's rights. All of that comes out of that one tournament. So it's all politically very charged. It both sport reflects society politically, but it also has an influence on society politically. So I think, again, if people have no interest there are plenty of other things to do as political organizers and political activists. But I think it's very, very good that we have some people who are interested in sports and to do the work there, because it is a very important political terrain.
Yeah. And conversely, for those who watch soccer on TV on weekends, there is considerably more political potential in the game than what you might see on the shiny surface of the Premier League or even the Bundesliga. There are in your book a number of little interesting vignettes, little individual stories, but also some project suggestions to actually change the way the game is played to untap some of that revolutionary potential that you're hinting at. One of them is three-sided football, and I was going to ask you about this because my daughter came home the other day and described something from school that sounded an awful lot like three-sided football. Is that actually being played? And what about these rule changes to change how the game works and to change the social and political aspects of the game?
I mean, it is being played in different ways. I don't know how many of the people who play it believe that they engage in some kind of revolutionary operation when they play it, but there are different levels to it. So it was conceived by an artist a few decades ago. So in that sense, that's where it originally comes from. But there was an idea. So what is three-sided football? Football for listeners who don't know. So you have three goals. You have three teams, and two teams can join up with one another to score against the third teams, and then those alliances can shift. And essentially, if you have a winner, if you even want to play it that way, at the end of the game, the team that would have conceded the least number of goals would have won. But one of the aspects of it is also that you don't necessarily have this one. No one goes home as one winner, and you don't have one winner and one loser that goes home. You have three teams. If you want to take it a step further, you can mix up those three teams as you play. So you have an interesting form of playing soccer. But at the end of the day, they're not half of the people there will go home as winners and half will go home as losers. Everyone will have won and lost at some point during that evening. So that was the original idea. There are some, or there have been at least, some organized tournaments based on that idea. But then there are other aspects to it. The three-sided football has been incorporated in football training by people because it's with changing alliances between the different teams. It also means that you constantly encounter new constellations on the pitch, and you have to react to that very quickly, which can correspond to certain ways that teams play football today, or just generally what happens on the football pitch. So that happens there too. So yeah, three-sided football is a real thing that's being used in different contexts. And I don't know what it was that your daughter played, but it's quite possible that their coach has adapted a form of three-sided football to include that in their training.
A radical coach.
Perhaps, that's the thing. Like maybe they just, some people that the political idea for some people might have been completely gone, and they just look at the
Right.
tactical advantage that you can win from playing that way. But originally, yes, I would see that as one example. I mean, there are others, but as one example, to play soccer, enjoy what the game has to offer without reproducing the hard competitiveness that's often involved in the game, even on a grassroots level. I think competitiveness, you find people, maybe also among radicals, who feel that, all sports is problematic. It's as soon as there is a competitive element. I don't belong to those people. Competitiveness, sometimes the boundary between playfulness and competitiveness is not so clear. So I don't think, I don't think you have to stop playing table tennis games because someone will win and someone will lose. That can be part of the human experience. That's all fine. But there is, even on the grassroots level, I mean, you can have, I watch kids play football, and some of the joy disappears because kids are already too much focused on winning and losing. So if you find ways to play the game where that aspect becomes mitigated through different ways of playing it, then I think that's a good thing.
There are two more things here that I'd like to explore for a little bit as we come to an end here, or help me explore. By the way, there is no index in the book. That's my one point of critique, and maybe if there was one, I would have found it more easily. The one aspect is masculinity and gender, and I know there's something in there. The other one is religion. Gender first, the importance of soccer played by women historically is much higher in the US than it is in Europe. Is that part of why soccer initially had this attraction among radicals and activists on the left in America, and perhaps less so in Europe? And does it hold back the progressive dimensions of the sport in Europe?
Yeah. I should say something real quick about the index. Don't tell the publisher that there should be an index. You're perfectly right, there should be one, but then they make me do one for the next edition, and it's so painful to do indexes. But you're correct. There should be an index, and it's not in there because it's just a lot of extra work. but I certainly accept that criticism. Now with the gender aspect. Yeah, I mean, I think I said that before. I do believe that in the US, that is a really strong factor that contributes to people on the left, liberals, to embrace soccer. I think in Europe, I think a lot has really changed. I mean, it's a terribly male sport still, but I think in the last 20 years, really a lot has changed on both on the both with regard to women playing soccer, but also with regard to women's spectators who've found their own voice in many ways and have a stronger influence. But I think the players, that makes a huge difference. I'm just thinking of, I've been living in Sweden for the past 15 years, where the women's national team is also more successful than the men's national team. And I can certainly see in society, and also with especially on the youth level, that has made a big difference in the sense that soccer is no longer seen as this, male domain that has certainly kept people still in the 1980s or 90s, political activists from having an interest in soccer. So I think that is changing. So I don't think that still keeps people or activists from engaging in soccer. Although, if we come back to the fan level or the supporter level, I think that's where you still have, a strong male dominance, and that might not be so attractive for a lot of people to get engaged there. However, and there's yet another aspect to it, which is that women's soccer, and that's a whole big question in itself, the future of women's soccer, because at this point, I mean, it's been professionalized enough that it's become a career option for young players, but it's still far from what we call the modern football industry in male soccer. So, for example, if you support a women's team here in Sweden, for example, it's fairly easy to have personal contact with the players just because you can go to their training sessions. They're approachable. There are not that many people at the games. So if you wanted to approach them afterwards, all of that is also possible. The culture around is different, a much more positive, joyful fan culture around women's football. So in a sense, women's football also provides a counterexample to the modern football industry. The problem is that we see tendencies, and I don't know, I go in circles what to think about it, that there is more money invested also in women's soccer. One of the most tangible examples is that 20 years ago, the most successful women's soccer teams in Europe were all teams that you would have never heard of in any male football context. They're teams from small towns that for different reasons focused on their women's teams rather than their men's teams. In Sweden, for example, the most successful women's team in the 1990s, which also won the European Cup a couple of times, was from Umeå, a small town in the far north, doesn't have a good men's team. Today, it's all very different. I mean, today, if you look at the Women's Champions League in soccer, the names are all the same, basically, that you see in the Men's Champions League. So there's Barcelona, and there's Arsenal, and there's Chelsea. Now, that opens up a lot of further opportunities for women players. The salaries go up, the conditions are more professional, the number of spectators is rising, but it also takes away some of the special character that women's football has had, and that made it a viable alternative to the modern football industry in the past 20 years. Now, to say that, well, that is the historical mission that female football players have, and so they shouldn't take those extra steps they shouldn't get higher salaries because then they start being absorbed by this modern football industry. I mean, that you can't really put that burden on women who just want to play soccer and at least earn sort of comparable wages to the man, which even the best female players are still light years away from. But yes, there is something in me also that it's kind of like, this was really, I don't know if that's the right way to go. Anyway, complex problem, but short answer to your question. No, I think in general, I don't think that the fact that football historically has been and still is a very male-dominated sport keeps progressives from. It's at least not one of the main reasons why progressives don't have an interest in it, or radicals.
Right. Yeah. No, that is the main question. I think you're right for the future of women's football. Does equity mean here it's going to become equally commercialized? And whatever the answer to that is, two guys shouldn't be the ones deciding it. It's certainly worth its own episode at some point. The other thing I was wondering about is religion, which doesn't need to be showing up in your book, but in how you describe the kind of dialectic relationship between sports and soccer in particular and radical politics, your counter against the opiate of the masses argument, etc. There's a lot of structural similarities here to what I would hear from progressive religious folks or from lefty Christians or interreligious people. Would you see that too? Is there a structural similarity in how football can relate to radical politics and the potential it might have, and vice versa, and how religion relates to it?
Yes, yeah, that would be my short answer. I mean, I'm no expert on progressive, radical religious movements. I'm not completely ignorant either. I've always had an interest, whether that's the Catholic workers or other groups that appear on the radar of progressive radical politics. And yeah, I would say there are similar elements. I mean, you'd have to look at it closely, but I mean, a lot of what I said would apply too, right? I mean, a lot of people are interested in sports. A lot of people still, in the States, even more so than in Europe, but also on a lot of other continents, they, adhere to a particular religion. And you have the same phenomena there. You have there's on a certain level, there's a lot of corruption, internal organization, conservative values, internal organizations that contradict, grassroots democratic values or whatever. But it's a very complex phenomenon, and you have a lot of on the grassroots level in different religions or even churches. You have forms of organizing that certainly jive with progressive and radical ideas, and sometimes provide environments where you can practically develop or express where you can express those ideas and values in practice, which then can be beneficial to political organizing. So yes.
I know you're currently not allowed to travel to the US in the heady and drama-filled time after 9/11. I think Homeland Security placed you on a no-flight list because you had been to some suspicious countries and carried one or two anarchist books in your luggage. But do you still travel widely? Is soccer and your interest in soccer connected to those travels? Is that a thing of the past from when the book came out, or does it continue?
No, that continues on all levels. I mean, I play on occasion when it comes for different reasons. It's less and less often that I get to play, but if I'm able to play, I do. I coach the kids at the local football club. I was involved in. We founded an alternative sports club in the parts of Stockholm that I live in about 10 years ago. The club still exists. I'm no longer involved, but I was very involved in the first few years. And I do go to stadiums on occasion. Although I actually, that was part of your very first question. I never answered that. I should say that now. The way I approach football, or my connection with football, is to having been a player and having a nerdy cultural political interest in the game. I am not a football fan as such. There is no particular team I support. I have more sympathies for certain teams than for others, but I don't see myself and have never seen myself as part of football fan culture. In fact, I can be more critical of football fan culture than a lot of the writers in the progressive football magazines I read, for example.
Why do you think that is?
Sorry?
Why do you think that is? Why can you be more critical of fan culture?
Oh, because I think that you do, even though I've said very positive things, which I meant about progressive German fan culture. But if you look, for example, at ultra culture, which has become sort of the most talked about phenomenon of fan organizing in the past 20 and 30 years. Just to give a very simple example, I mean, you have these people who basically capos, so they tell the group of supporters behind them, they usually don't even watch the game. They have their backs turned to the game, and then they tell people what to chant, and people all do that together. Like, to me, those sorts of mass rituals, I'm not interested in that. To me, that's fairly. It's kind of silly, I suppose. I mean, I understand why people like it. I understand what people get out of it, but I don't. Then there are the territorial aspects. These things where, your whole world falls apart if a rival supporters group is stealing your banner or stuff like that. I mean, there's a lot of stuff like that involved in football culture, that the supporter culture, that I see as fairly archaic forms of social organizing, I suppose. So yeah, there's never been anything that's been particularly attractive for me about football fan culture. So that was now a side note. But I do go to games myself because I am interested in what's happening there. So yes, coming back to answering your question. So yes, I do that. I write regularly about football, now mainly for German language papers. So yeah, no, I mean, my connections to football are as strong as they've always been.
That's interesting, and certainly something more for me to think about as well. I came of age in soccer culture in Europe when the ultra movements were just on the rise, in Austria and in Germany particularly, and they've deeply shaped, I think, the way I approach the game. But it is helpful to see, and it's not the first time, but you've articulated it particularly clearly, where I'm seeing some ways in which those movements also reinforce structures of the game that may be anything but radical, right?
I mean, it's just to add to that too. And I mean, I know this is a difference, and some people, especially if they're big football fans themselves, they might be disappointed. But like now, for example, I just watch in the news, you watch all the celebrations in Argentina about Argentina winning the World Cup. And I mean, there's a lot of joy involved, which is great, but there's a lot I don't know, there are many aspects to that. And I'm just like, why? Like, why? I don't. I mean, with all the interest I have in it, okay, so they won a football game, and people are happy. That's fine, but there's something there. I guess it's just the sort of mass celebration type stuff that maybe makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, okay, I can certainly sympathize with that, even when my own teams win, especially at that kind of grand scale. Yeah. All right. Soccer versus the State, Tackling Football and Radical Politics is the title of the book. It is out in its second edition by PM Press. Buy it preferably, as always, from the publisher, but if you must, from the online distributor of your choice as well. That is, I should say, nowhere near Gabriel's only book. There's two particularly interesting ones that I came across on the list. One is about the connection of a movement of bank robbers in Denmark that aided with the money that they robbed, I think, radical causes. I hope I got that right.
It's about one particular group in Denmark where people did rob banks and warehouses over a 17-year period and gave all the money they made to liberation movements in the global south.
There you go. And then there's a mini series of two books that are of particular interest to me, and I'm reading through right now, that have nothing to do with soccer, but both deal with straight edge, hardcore punk, and sobriety. So kind of the sober, drug-free, alcohol-free wing of the punk movement. Did I get that right?
Yeah, you can say that. Yeah. There's more religion in there too than in the soccer book, if people want to read about religion.
I'll go to that next, probably. Thank you so much for your time.
I can add, sorry, the books, suggest books. I can add, the most recent one in English is about Sapmi. People should they don't have to read the book, but Sapmi is that's the indigenous territory in the far north of Scandinavia, where the Sami people live.
Right.
People, yeah, just in general, it's a very interesting topic. People should check that out.
Right. And you have a website that chronicles your past and present writing as well. And I will link that in the show notes too. Thank you so much for the time. Normally I ask, is there anything we haven't covered yet? We've talked for quite a while, but I'm still going to ask, is there anything that we forgot, that we didn't pick up on?
No, I thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to answer questions. I don't, as you said, I've already talked a lot. I don't have to add anything from my side. Thanks for the interesting questions and for having me on the program.
Thank you, Gabriel. And greetings to Sweden, where I hope to be again next year. Thank you for coming, for a wonderful book, which I was glad to pick up, and I hope many others do as well after listening to this. Thank you very much for your time, and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you, as always, for listening and for spending time with me, and a really interesting guest as well. If you've been listening up to this point, I'm sure you have a second as well to click subscribe or leave a rating. Stockholm, Sweden really is next, and we will spend time looking at the derbies and the three big teams and big rivalries in that city. And then Vienna is on the horizon in the more immediate future as well. So 2 city trips to 2 European capitals, and a look at what soccer culture is like there. 2 weeks, the next episode drops, and until then, I look forward to being with you again.